J'invite tous les Français, où qu'ils se trouvent actuellement, à se mettre en rapport avec moi.
Welcome to a new edition of France in Focus. I'm Nadia Charby, and this week we're following in the unmistakable stride of this man, the Général de Gaulle, as we mark 80 years since his famed June 18th appeal to join Free French forces against Nazi occupation. This just 4 days after victorious German troops paraded down this very avenue. Now let's hear more first about this historic address that didn't immediately play out as the founding moment of the French resistance.
In June 1940, Adolf Hitler's forces invaded France. As panic spread across the country, millions of French people fled the advance of German troops as they arrived in Paris on the 10th of June. Taking refuge in Bordeaux, the government was split between supporters of the armistice, such as Marshal Pétain, and those who wanted to continue the war. As yet unknown, Charles de Gaulle was in charge of coordinating military action with the UK. On the 16th and 17th of June, he went back and forth between Bordeaux and London. He understood that the government, now led by Marshal Pétain, was about to give way to Germany. In London, he met with Winston Churchill and launched his very first appeal for resistance. On the 18th of June 1940, at 6:30 p.m. from BBC headquarters, he called on French soldiers to join him in London and to continue their fight. Few French people would hear the appeal, though it was published in the press. On the 19th of June, the speech hit the front page of the Petit Provençal, published in France's Free Zone. A response to Marshal Pétain, who was about to sign the armistice with Nazi Germany. He did so on June 22nd. General de Gaulle then repeated his call on the radio waves.
J'invite tous les Français qui veulent rester libres à m'écouter et à me suivre. Vive la France, libre, dans l'honneur et dans l'indépendance.
Now, fittingly, just a stone's throw away from the statue of de Gaulle is that of his British ally, Winston Churchill, who gave asylum to the general and his rebel army of volunteers. And while very few people actually managed to cross the Channel in the immediate aftermath of that fateful appeal, among those who did were all the able-bodied men of the little Breton island of Saint.
This island off the coast of Brittany may be small, but it was at the heart of the beginning of the resistance. In response to Charles de Gaulle's call to arms on June 18, 1940, all of the island's 128 able-bodied men joined the Free French forces. On the nearby mainland, troops and civilians refusing to accept defeat were also looking to join, including Jacques de Gaulle. When he was 19, he and his 17-year-old brother boarded the island's postal boat, the Zenith, the first French boat to arrive in England.
Si on n'avait pas réagi comme ça, le général de Gaulle n'aurait pas eu un crédit suffisant pour démarrer la France. Il n'avait personne autour de nous, il avait 300 ou 400 ou 500 militaires, et puis nous.
Initially, de Gaulle was relatively unknown. Most volunteers were young and inexperienced. Those who were competent were immediately given high-ranking positions. Meanwhile, in London, the Free French Air Forces were welcomed at the French Institute, or l'Institut Français, whose director, Denis Saurat, immediately rallied behind de Gaulle.
Ici, nous avons une photo de Denis Saurat avec le général de Gaulle. Et ça, c'est une photo qui a été prise au Queen's Hall lors d'une conférence organisée par Denis Saurat avec le général de Gaulle pour promouvoir ses idées à Londres, en juillet 40.
On July 14th, the Free French forces marched in London before an enthusiastic and united British crowd. There were only 3,000 volunteers, but they ultimately gave rise to the French resistance, fighting for 5 years alongside the Allied forces.
Well, in recognition of the pioneers of the Free France effort, de Gaulle created the prestigious Resistance Medal. And to tell us more, I've come to the Museum of the Order of Liberation at the Invalides to meet historian and curator Vladimir Troublin. Vladimir Troublin, hello, thank you very much for having us.
Hello, you're welcome.
Thank you. De Gaulle created this Order of Liberation in 1940. What was its aim?
The general's first aim was obviously to reward his worthiest supporters, the few hundred men and women who came to join him, and of course to encourage others by example. But there was also a political ambition there, to instate him as a legitimate leader, the leader of Free France, as opposed to Maréchal Pétain, who surrendered to the Nazis but at the time had more legitimacy. So he created this Order of Liberation on what was then French soil in Congo-Brazzaville on November the 16th, 1940.
Can we perhaps go and see some of these companions of the liberation?
Of course, let's go.
Now, this museum is separated in two parts, Free France and the resistance movement. What's the difference?
Free France is what you might call external resistance. Men and women joined de Gaulle, first in England and then in Africa, when part of France's colonial territories rallied the general to pick up the fight. It was very much a military force, organised just like an army. And on the other hand, you had the resistance movement within, working undercover in occupied France. It was covert work, in the shadows, hidden by intelligence networks, before later morphing into an armed struggle, the so-called maquis. So there were two different types of resistance.
And Free France extends well beyond its London base.
Free France owes everything to the British, because initially de Gaulle was a military leader in exile. But after a number of French colonies in Equatorial Africa and New Caledonia sided with the general in the summer of 1940, de Gaulle had a wider territorial base that offered him the necessary legitimacy to pursue the struggle.
And that diversity is reflected in the selection of companions?
Absolutely. In fact, the 1,038 companions of liberation who were awarded this medal hailed from 25 different countries. A number of them came from the Foreign Legion, which means they were foreign volunteers who fought for France and often died for France in the resistance effort. And beyond French soldiers and these foreign troops, there were also what were known as indigenous forces from France's colonies, who didn't even have French citizenship. I'm thinking mainly of the infantry regiment that made up 50 to 60% of de Gaulle's ground forces. They came from sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular Chad, Cameroon, and what was then French Congo.
So once France was liberated, how did de Gaulle draw on the symbol, the myth of the French resistance?
De Gaulle used the resistance movement as a symbol, but also for political recognition. A potent example was his decision in 1964 to honour resistance leader Jean Moulin by having his ashes transferred to the Panthéon, an honour bestowed only upon the country's most illustrious figures. At the time, Moulin was a complete unknown. But it's an approach that also reflects how French society viewed the conflict back then. For instance, the darker issue of the Vichy regime and French collaboration only came to light in the 1970s, and even then, only through the work of an American historian, Robert Paxton. So France struggled to confront its past, because it's always easier to remember the glory days and forget the rest.
Vladimir Troplin, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
To this day, France's civilian and military resistance is largely remembered through the actions of two great men, dissident official Jean Moulin and General Leclerc de Hautecloque. The two men never met, as Moulin died in Gestapo hands in 1943, but they've been united posthumously in this recently opened Museum of Liberation.
Curator Sylvie Zeidman tells us more now about these two figureheads and the site's rich history.
The collective memory is a social construct, of course, but it's also political, which is why General Leclerc was chosen to embody the image of a country that fights back, that takes on Nazi Germany. He personified the external resistance of Free France. Meanwhile, Jean Moulin represented the resistance from within, and he's the one who managed to organize and structure the resistance movement on the ground.
As for Paris, in the final weeks of combat, the resistance movement went quite literally underground in a subterranean HQ that runs just below this museum, some 20 meters down.
This shelter was built in 1938-1939 and was originally erected to allow the capital's technical services to keep functioning, even if Paris were to come under heavy bombing. Then, in August 1944, the military forces of the resistance movement had come together under what was known as the French Forces of the Interior, or FFI, and the head of the Paris branch was Colonel Rolle. At that time, Rolle was on the lookout for a place to set up his HQ, and an engineer told him about this shelter. And in the final week of fighting, leading up to the liberation of Paris, this is where he was holed up with his fighters.
Government British News has already shown in full the story of the triumphant march down the Champs-Élysées.
So, in a way, this is where the resistance journey ends. Because the arrival in Paris of General Leclerc and his troops signaled the defeat and capitulation of Germany, the end of the war. Of course, the movement and its members lived on, but they weren't really suited to peacetime and a grand old institution like the French Republic. So they simply transformed into traditional political parties.
And with that, we leave this edition. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to France 24.